My name is Naomi Ashford, and I am 34 years old, and this is the whole story, every hour of it, exactly as it happened, told in full, start to finish, the one that started with a warning nobody listened to and ended with a demolition crew 48 hours from bulldozing the only proof of what actually happened that night. A story I have carried quietly for longer than I ever expected to before, finally deciding it deserved to be told completely. 6 years ago, on the evening I was certified as a fire and explosion investigator, one of a small handful of women in the state to hold that particular credential, my parents were not in the small hotel conference room where the state association held its induction ceremony. They were across town, standing under string lights at the grand opening of the new distribution center my younger brother Caleb had just been named to run, cutting a wide ribbon in front of a crowd of nearly 150 people, celebrating the milestone my father called, in a toast I only heard about secondhand, the real future of this family's business, a phrase that months later would echo strangely in my mind every time I thought about the panel I'd once tried to warn him about. I found out where they were from a text message my mother sent at 6:40 that evening, 20 minutes before I was called to the podium, a message I have reread more times than I could ever count in the years since, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone you can't quite put down. It read, "Asterisk, sweetheart, we are so proud of you, but tonight is such a big deal for Caleb and the whole company, you understand. We'll take you out to celebrate this weekend, I promise. Love you, Yellowheart, asterisk." I want you to hold that message in your mind for the next 10,000 words, because everything that follows, the 2 a.m. phone call about the fire, the man found unconscious in a section of the building that should have been empty, the second point of origin someone tried to hide inside the wreckage of the first, the 48 hours I had to prove what actually happened before a bulldozer erased it forever, the keycard timestamp that would eventually put my own father's freedom on the line. All of it traces back to a warning I gave this family 18 years ago in a hallway of that very same warehouse, when I was 16 years old and nobody in my family believed a teenage girl could possibly understand something about their own building that they didn't. Before I take you into what happened, minute by minute, hour by hour, if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe now, because I promise you this story does not ease you in gently. And if you've been with us before, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because by the end of this one, I think a lot of you are going to need a minute before you type anything at all. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly what that warehouse looked like 18 years before it ever caught fire, and exactly what kind of family builds an entire identity around a business without ever once stopping to examine the risks quietly accumulating in its own walls.
Ashford Furniture Manufacturing was founded in 1958 by my grandfather, a modest operation that grew, over 3 generations, into the largest furniture manufacturer in our county, employing at its peak nearly 200 people across a main production floor and an adjoining warehouse built in the early 1970s to store finished inventory before shipping, a building that would, decades later, become the site of everything I am about to tell you. My father, Gerald Ashford, took over the company from his own father in the late 1980s, and by the time I was a teenager, it was, in the way of many small-town family businesses, something close to the emotional center of our entire household. Dinner conversations built around production schedules, family vacations planned around trade shows. My father's mood on any given evening tied directly to how the day's output numbers had looked, a rhythm the whole family simply learned to live inside, without ever fully questioning it. I was born first. Caleb came 3 years later, and from almost the moment he could hold a conversation with an adult, he possessed the exact quality my father valued most in a future leader of the business, an easy, natural charisma that made buyers and floor workers alike feel instantly at ease around him, the kind of presence my father called, more than once, a born Ashford. My own interests, even as a young teenager, ran in a very different direction. I was fascinated from around the age of 13, not by the sales floor or the client relationships, but by the physical building itself, how it was constructed, how its systems worked, and, increasingly, how those systems could fail. I want to tell you about the specific afternoon that shaped the entire rest of my life, because it is the single most important piece of context for everything that followed. I was 16, spending a summer working part-time in the warehouse's small administrative office, when I noticed something during a routine walk through the older section of the building. a section built in the original 1970s construction, still running on its original electrical distribution panel, one my father had, for years, deferred upgrading because the cost of a full electrical retrofit competed directly against newer, more visible investments like showroom renovations and delivery trucks. I noticed the panel's breaker box was warm to the touch, unusually warm, and that one of the circuits serving the older storage racks had a faint, acrid smell around it that I now recognize, with 18 years of professional training behind me, as the unmistakable early signature of overheated, degrading wire insulation. I brought this to my father directly, nervous but certain, having spent the previous several weeks reading everything I could find about electrical safety after a school science fair project on fire causation had accidentally turned into a genuine obsession. My father listened, mostly out of politeness, and then told me, in the kind, distracted way parents sometimes dismiss a child's concern without ever quite calling a dismissal, that the panel had been like that for years. It's fine. That's just how old buildings smell. I asked if we could at least have an electrician look at it. He said he'd put it on the list for next year's budget cycle. I don't believe, even now, that my father intended any real harm by that response. I believe, simply, that a 16-year-old girl's technical concern did not carry the same weight in that office as it would have if it had come from almost anyone else standing in that room. I don't tell you this to paint my family as villains, not yet, not in this part of the story. I believe even now that my parents loved both their children. But there is a particular, quiet danger in a family business built for generations around presence and charm, where the child who reassures people in a room becomes the presumed face of the company's future, while the child who actually understands where the building itself can fail gets gently filed away as the technical one, valuable in theory, dismissed the moment her technical concerns became inconvenient. There's a second memory from that same period I've rarely told anyone outside of Marcus, and I want to share it here, because it captures something the panel story only gestures at. About a year after that first warning, I noticed the same faint, acrid smell had spread to a second section of the warehouse, near a bank of newer storage racks installed to handle increased inventory. I brought it up again at a family dinner, more nervous this time, having already been gently dismissed once, and my father, mid-conversation about a new client account Caleb had helped land that week, said, without any real malice, "Naomi, you're going to give yourself an ulcer worrying about things that aren't your job to worry about. Let the maintenance crew handle the building. You worry about school." I remember looking down at my plate, feeling something small and important close itself off inside me, the exact moment I stopped bringing my concerns to that table at all, and started, instead, quietly teaching myself everything I could about fire causation and electrical safety on my own, in my room, at night, with library books nobody in my family ever asked about. I pursued a degree in fire protection engineering specifically because of that afternoon in the warehouse, driven by a need I couldn't fully articulate at 16 but understood completely by the time I was 22. I wanted to become the kind of person whose warnings couldn't be so easily set aside. I told my parents this plan explicitly more than once over the years, and each time, my father responded warmly but vaguely, always pivoting, often within the same conversation, to an update about Caleb, a new client account Caleb had landed, a warehouse expansion Caleb was helping plan, a leadership seminar Caleb had just returned from. I remember one particular conversation during my second year of graduate study when I called my father specifically to discuss my growing interest in industrial fire risk assessment, hoping to eventually propose a formal safety audit of the company's older facilities as a graduate capstone project. He listened for perhaps 4 minutes, asked a single polite question about my coursework, and then spent the remaining 20 minutes of the call discussing a new equipment financing deal Caleb had just negotiated for the distribution subsidiary. I hung up that call and sat with a familiar, hollow feeling I'd first learned to recognize at 16, the specific sensation of being technically included in a conversation while being, in every way that actually mattered, entirely absent from it. The actual decision about the company's future leadership happened, as most significant decisions in my family seemed to, entirely without me in the room. I learned during my final year of graduate study that my father had begun the formal process of naming Caleb president of a newly formed distribution subsidiary, a decision discussed with the company's attorney and accountant before it was ever discussed with me. When I asked, carefully, what that meant for the safety and risk oversight role I'd explicitly told them I hoped to build, my mother said, gently, "Darling, that's still so important, and we're grateful you care. But the company needs a leader people trust in the room, and you've always been better suited to the technical side, working quietly behind the scenes." Behind the scenes, 18 years after a warehouse full of people had continued working every single day beside a panel I'd already identified as failing, that phrase would very nearly become the reason nobody realized, until it was almost too late, exactly how dangerous behind the scenes had actually become. Hashtag part 3. The ceremony. I completed my fire and explosion investigator certification the following winter, one of the most demanding credentials in my field, requiring years of qualifying casework and a rigorous, multi-day examination. I told my parents the exact date months in advance. They said they'd be there. Then, 3 weeks before the ceremony, Caleb's distribution center's grand opening, originally scheduled for the following month, was moved up to coincide with a major buyer's visit, landing on the exact same evening, and my parents chose the ribbon cutting without more than a single brief conversation. I stood in that hotel conference room, reading my mother's text message, and felt something in me finish breaking that had been cracking slowly for nearly 2 decades. I did not cry. I remember looking around that modest conference room, folding chairs and a simple podium, no champagne, no string lights, nothing of the polish happening across town, and thinking, with a strange, hollow clarity, that this room actually represented the exact discipline my family's business claimed to value and had never once, in my experience, actually practiced, earned credibility, verified rigorously, built without any need for charm to dress it up. I accepted my certification in front of a modest crowd that included my graduate advisor and 2 colleagues, and 2 weeks later, I called my parents and told them, calmly, that I needed real distance from the family. My mother called it dramatic. My father said I'd always taken things harder than necessary. I told them both I loved them and I meant it, and then I stopped answering their calls. 6 years passed. I built an independent fire investigation firm, Beacon Forensic Investigations, specializing in cause and origin analysis for insurers, attorneys, and, occasionally, criminal prosecutors investigating suspected arson. I married a structural engineer named Marcus Delaney, someone who understood, without needing it explained, exactly why a person could love a family and still need real distance from it. We built a life together grounded in the same quiet, methodical values I'd spent my entire adolescence being told belonged behind the scenes rather than at the center of anything. I did not speak to my parents or to Caleb for 6 years. I completed my fire and explosion investigator certification the following winter, one of the most demanding credentials in my field, requiring years of qualifying casework and a rigorous, multi-day examination. I told my parents the exact date months in advance. They said they'd be there. Then, 3 weeks before the ceremony, Caleb's distribution center's grand opening, originally scheduled for the following month, was moved up to coincide with a major buyer's visit, landing on the exact same evening, and my parents chose the ribbon cutting without more than a single brief conversation. I stood in that hotel conference room, reading my mother's text message, and felt something in me finish breaking that had been cracking slowly for nearly 2 decades. I did not cry. I remember looking around that modest conference room, folding chairs and a simple podium, no champagne, no string lights, nothing of the polish happening across town, and thinking, with a strange, hollow clarity, that this room actually represented the exact discipline my family's business claimed to value and had never once, in my experience, actually practiced, earned credibility, verified rigorously, built without any need for charm to dress it up. I accepted my certification in front of a modest crowd that included my graduate advisor and 2 colleagues, and 2 weeks later, I called my parents and told them, calmly, that I needed real distance from the family. My mother called it dramatic. My father said I'd always taken things harder than necessary. I told them both I loved them and I meant it, and then I stopped answering their calls. 6 years passed. I built an independent fire investigation firm, Beacon Forensic Investigations, specializing in cause and origin analysis for insurers, attorneys, and, occasionally, criminal prosecutors investigating suspected arson. I married a structural engineer named Marcus Delaney, someone who understood, without needing it explained, exactly why a person could love a family and still need real distance from it. We built a life together grounded in the same quiet, methodical values I'd spent my entire adolescence being told belonged behind the scenes rather than at the center of anything. I did not speak to my parents or to Caleb for 6 years. I want to tell you honestly what those 6 years actually looked like, because I think the polished version skips past the part that shaped who I actually became. My first 2 years in the field were spent as a junior investigator under a formidable mentor named Ruth Calloway, a woman who had spent 30 years reading burn patterns and char depth the way most people read a familiar book, and who taught me the single principle that would matter more than any other. Years later, standing in the wreckage of my own family's warehouse, a fire scene tells the truth in layers, and your job is never to arrive with a conclusion already in mind, only a discipline. Patient enough to let the evidence speak for itself, no matter how many times it contradicts what you expected to find. I remember one early case with Ruth, a small residential fire where the local fire marshal had already concluded, based on a quick initial walkthrough, that a homeowner had accidentally started the blaze while smoking in bed. Ruth spent 4 additional hours on that scene, moving slower and more methodically than I understood the value of at the time, and eventually found char patterns that told an entirely different story: a faulty extension cord running behind a bookshelf, overloaded well beyond its rated capacity, the true point of origin. She turned to me that day and said, "The scene doesn't care what anyone assumed before we got here, Naomi. It only cares whether you're patient enough to actually look." I have carried that sentence with me through every single case since, though I don't think I ever expected, back then, that I would one day need it standing inside my own family's building. Ruth retired the year before Ashford Furniture caught fire, and I remember calling her, unable to help myself, sometime around hour 20 of that investigation, simply needing to hear her voice, needing some small piece of reassurance from the person who had taught me everything I now relied on. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, the way she always had, and when I finished, she said only, "You already know exactly what to do, Naomi. You've known since you were 16 years old standing in that hallway. Go do the work." I hung up that call feeling steadier than I had in hours, carrying her voice with me through the remaining 28 hours of the investigation, like a kind of quiet anchor. I built Beacon slowly over 4 years, on cases that took me into burned homes, collapsed retail stores, and, twice, into fatal fires where my findings became the difference between a family collecting on a life insurance policy or being denied it entirely because of a wrongly assumed cause. I remember one case in particular, about a year before everything with my own family happened, investigating a house fire that a hasty local fire marshal had initially ruled accidental, caused by a space heater, a finding that would have denied the grieving widow her insurance payout because her policy excluded certain heater-related claims. My own investigation found, through careful analysis of the burn patterns and a wiring defect the original investigator had missed entirely, that the actual cause was a failed electrical junction box, not the heater at all, a finding that changed everything for that family, financially and emotionally, because it meant her home hadn't burned down due to her own carelessness, the story she'd been quietly blaming herself for since the day it happened. I remember sitting with that widow in her temporary rental apartment, walking her through my findings page by page, watching her expression shift slowly from guarded exhaustion to something closer to relief, and then, unexpectedly, to tears, as she finally understood that the guilt she'd been carrying for months had never actually belonged to her at all. She told me, near the end of that conversation, that she'd spent every night since the fire replaying the moment she'd turned that space heater on, certain she'd killed her own home through carelessness, and that my report was the first thing in months that had let her sleep through an entire night. I have thought about that conversation often since because it taught me something I don't think I fully understood before that case. The work I do isn't only about assigning blame correctly. It's about giving people back the true version of their own story, whatever that story turns out to be. I thought about that widow often in the months that followed, understanding, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had built an entire career around exactly the kind of patient, careful truth-telling my own family had once decided, at 16, wasn't worth a phone call to an electrician. I decided, without fully realizing I was deciding it, that if a moment like this ever arrived involving my own family, I wanted to be exactly the investigator I'd been for that widow. Careful, patient, willing to let the evidence lead wherever it went, regardless of who it implicated. At 2:14 in the morning, 6 years after I'd stopped answering my family's calls, Ashford Furniture Manufacturing's main warehouse caught fire. I did not learn about it that night. I learned about it 4 days later, when my office received a formal engagement request from the insurance carrier holding the company's commercial property policy, requesting an independent cause and origin investigation before they would authorize payment on a claim that, given the warehouse's full inventory loss, was likely to exceed $4 million. I want you to understand something about how these engagements typically work because it matters for what happened next. When a commercial property claim reaches a certain size, especially one involving a business with any recent financial strain, insurers routinely bring in an independent investigator before paying out, standard due diligence rather than any specific accusation. I did not recognize the firm's name at first glance on the engagement letter, the way it always seems to happen in these moments, ordinary paperwork arriving on an ordinary morning before it reveals itself to be anything but ordinary at all. The letter listed only the property address, not the business name, and it was not until I opened the loss summary and saw Ashford Furniture Manufacturing, LLC, listed as the insured party that I felt the floor of my own office seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. I remember sitting perfectly still at my desk for several seconds after reading that name, my coffee mug halfway to my mouth, feeling a strange, disorienting collision between the ordinary Tuesday morning I'd been having and the sudden reappearance of a building, a family, and 18 years of history I had spent 6 full years deliberately not thinking about, the whole weight of it arriving all at once, uninvited, exactly the way grief and old memory always seem to arrive when you least expect them. I read the loss summary 3 more times, as though rereading it might somehow change what it said, before I finally set my coffee down and forced myself to keep reading, the way my training had taught me to keep working through discomfort rather than around it. I sat with that engagement letter for a long time that evening, feeling something far more complicated than the professional recognition I'd felt on previous cases involving my family's businesses outside vendors. This was not a warehouse belonging to a stranger. This was the building where, 18 years earlier, a 16-year-old version of me had stood beside a warm, acrid-smelling breaker panel and been told, gently, that it was fine. I called Marcus that night and told him everything, sitting on the edge of our bed with the lights still off, my voice steadier than I actually felt, the words coming slower than usual as I tried to explain, for the first time out loud to another person, exactly what it meant to be standing at the edge of a case that reached all the way back to who I was at 16 years old. He asked me the question I imagine, by now, most of you listening have heard before in some form on this channel. Do you want to recuse yourself right now before you go any further? I told him I needed to think, and that night, sitting at our kitchen table long after he'd gone to bed, I made the decision that would define the next 48 hours of my life. I would disclose the conflict formally, and I would let the insurer decide whether to proceed with me or reassign the case. But some part of me, the same stubborn part that had once believed a 16-year-old girl's warning deserved to be taken seriously, desperately needed to know what had actually happened inside that building. The insurer, after a tense conversation with their own claims counsel, made the same kind of unusual decision I'd once seen a securities regulator make in an entirely different case, given how rapidly a demolition and site-clearing crew was already scheduled to begin work. The property's landlord, in this case my own father, had a separate contractual obligation with the site's ground lease requiring debris clearance within a set window, and that window closed in just under 48 hours. From the moment I accepted the engagement, reassigning the case to an unfamiliar investigator risked losing critical physical evidence entirely before a replacement could even begin work. They authorized me to proceed under strict independent oversight, my findings to be separately verified by a second investigator before being relied upon for any claims decision, with all communication routed through the insurer's claims counsel rather than any direct contact with my family. I remember the exact moment I learned about that 48-hour demolition window, sitting on a conference call with the insurer's claims team, feeling the full weight of the timeline settle over me for the first time. 48 hours to walk through the physical remains of a building I had once known intimately, to trace the story of a fire back to its true beginning, and to do it all under the added, unspoken pressure of knowing that every hour that passed brought the bulldozers 1 hour closer, regardless of how much of the truth I had or hadn't yet uncovered. I arrived at the site the following morning, before dawn, wearing full protective gear, walking into the charred, still faintly smoking remains of a building I had once known well enough to navigate blindfolded as a teenager. I want to describe this scene honestly, because I think the reality of a fire scene is far less cinematic and far more devastating, in a quiet way, than people expect. The smell, sharp and chemical and strangely sweet all at once, the way blackened structural beams still ticked and settled hours after the flames were out, the eerie, waterlogged silence of a building that had once been full of machinery, noise, and voices. I stood at the edge of the collapsed loading dock for a long moment before I made myself walk further in, feeling something I hadn't fully braced for, the specific, disorienting experience of recognizing a building by its bones even after everything that had once made it recognizable was gone. I found the outline of the old break room where I used to eat lunch during that summer job at 16, reduced now to a black rectangle of collapsed drywall and melted vinyl flooring. I found, further in, the twisted remains of shelving units I remembered stacking finished dining chairs onto as a teenager, the wood long since consumed, leaving only the warped metal frames standing at strange angles against the gray morning light coming through what had once been a roof. I remember standing in the middle of that ruined production floor for a long moment, my breath fogging faintly inside my respirator in the cold morning air, feeling 18 years of memory and 2 days of investigation collapse into a single, overwhelming instant, before I forced myself to keep moving, to keep working because the clock, even in that moment of quiet grief, had already started. Within the first 2 hours of my examination, using standard cause and origin methodology, mapping char depth and burn patterns across the structure to trace the fire's path backward toward its point of ignition, I identified the primary area of origin in the exact section of the building I remembered from 18 years earlier, the older 1970s electrical distribution area, serving the same storage racks I had once stood beside as a teenager. The burn pattern, the specific V-shaped char pattern radiating from a single point on the wall, the melted, fused condition of the old panel's internal components, told a clear, consistent story, an electrical failure, almost certainly originating in exactly the aging, overloaded circuit I had identified 18 years earlier and been told, gently, not to worry about. I stood in front of that ruined panel for a long time that morning, feeling something I had not expected to feel walking into this investigation. Not vindication, not anger exactly, but a kind of quiet, devastating grief for the 16-year-old girl who had once done everything right, who had noticed the problem, named it clearly and asked the right question of the right adult, and had still, somehow, not been enough to prevent this. I remember reaching out, almost involuntarily, to touch the edge of the panel's melted housing with a gloved hand, feeling the strange, cold weight of standing exactly where I had stood 18 years earlier, except this time, the warning I had once given was no longer a hypothesis. It was, finally, undeniable, laid out in melted metal and scorched wire for anyone with the right training to read. I photographed that panel from every angle the forensic protocol required, documented the char depth measurements with the same careful precision I would use on any other case, and made myself, deliberately, set aside the personal weight of the moment long enough to finish the work in front of me, because I understood, even then, that grief could wait, but the physical evidence in front of me, with a demolition crew already scheduled, could not. It was during my 3rd hour on site, reviewing the incident report filed by the responding fire department, that I learned something the insurer's initial claim summary had not fully conveyed. A night watchman named Walter Higgins, 67 years old, had been inside the warehouse at the time the fire started, working his regular overnight security rounds, and had been found by firefighters unconscious from smoke inhalation in a section of the building nearly 150 feet from the building's designated night shift break room, a section that, according to the company's own posted safety protocols, should have been locked and off-limits during overnight hours specifically because of ongoing inventory reorganization work. Walter had been pulled from the building with severe smoke inhalation and second-degree burns, and, according to the hospital records the insurer had already obtained as part of their claim file, remained in critical condition in the Regional Trauma Center's intensive care unit, his prognosis still genuinely uncertain 4 days after the fire. I want you to sit with that fact with me because it changed everything about how I approached the remainder of this investigation, reframing every subsequent hour of work I did on that site, every photograph, every measurement, every sample I collected. This was no longer simply a property damage claim. If Walter Higgins died from his injuries, this investigation could become the foundation of a manslaughter case, and if there was any indication that the section he'd been found in had been improperly accessible, or that anyone had known about a risk to his safety that night and failed to act, the stakes of every finding I made were about to become exponentially higher than any case I had worked in my entire career. I pulled Walter's personnel file from the records the insurer had already obtained and found a man who had worked at Ashford Furniture for 11 years, described by 3 separate co-workers in preliminary interview notes as the most reliable overnight guy we ever had. Someone who took his rounds seriously enough that he'd once, according to one supervisor's note, called in a minor electrical spark from a floor buffer at 2 in the morning rather than assume it was nothing, a small, unglamorous act of diligence that, reading it months later, struck me as almost eerily similar to the exact kind of vigilance I had once tried and failed to have taken seriously at 16. I remember reading that detail and feeling something tighten in my chest, a man who took exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous vigilance seriously that my own family had once decided, at 16, wasn't worth an electrician's visit. I called the insurer's claims counsel immediately and asked a question that, until that moment, had not been part of my original scope. Why had Walter been in a section of the building that should have been locked? She told me, after checking with the company, that Ashford Furniture's management had explained the lock on that section's access door had been temporarily disabled for ongoing inventory work and that Walter, for his usual overnight rounds, had simply walked through an area he normally would not have had access to. I noted the explanation, and I noted, with the same clinical, careful attention I would give any other detail in a case file, that something about the phrasing, temporarily disabled, offered so smoothly, so immediately, did not sit right with the instincts I had spent 6 years training myself to trust. It was during hour 9 of my examination, deep into a detailed survey of the building's rear loading section, roughly 60 feet from the primary point of origin I'd already identified at the old electrical panel, that I found something that turned this investigation from a tragic accident into something far more dangerous. A second, distinct area of fire damage bearing none of the burn characteristics consistent with fire spread from the original electrical origin point. Instead, this second area showed the unmistakable signature of a separately ignited fire, a low, V-shaped burn pattern at floor level, consistent with a liquid accelerant, and, when I collected debris samples from the affected flooring for laboratory analysis, a faint but distinct petroleum-based odor that had no business being anywhere near a furniture warehouse's rear loading dock. I remember crouching in that section for a long time, running my gloved hand carefully along the edge of the scorched concrete, cross-referencing the burn depth against the primary origin point's known progression rate, doing the careful, methodical math that told me, beyond any reasonable doubt, that these 2 fires could not have started from the same source at the same time. The electrical fire, based on the char depth I'd already documented, had been burning for a documented period before this second area ever ignited. Someone had walked into that section of a building that was already actively on fire and set a second, deliberate blaze. I stood in that section of the building for a long moment, feeling the same cold, physical lurch I imagine any investigator feels at the exact moment a routine case becomes something else entirely. Someone had gone back into that building after the original electrical fire had already started. Likely, based on the burn progression timeline I would spend the following hours reconstructing, sometime in the roughly 11-minute gap between when the fire's smoke alarm first triggered and when the first fire department unit arrived on scene and deliberately set a second fire, using an accelerant, in a section of the building far from the original, accidental point of origin. I want to walk you through exactly why this mattered so much, because the implications were staggering. A genuinely accidental electrical fire, however tragic, however preventable, is not insurance fraud. A deliberately set second fire, layered on top of an accidental one, transforms the entire claim into arson, and if whoever set that second fire understood, even faintly, that Walter Higgins was still somewhere inside the building at that moment, it transformed the situation into something closer to attempted murder, or, if Walter did not survive his injuries, something far worse. I photographed and sampled that second origin point with the same meticulous chain of custody protocol I'd used on the original electrical panel, my hands steady despite everything happening inside me, because I understood, in that moment, exactly how much depended on every single piece of that documentation being unimpeachable. Every photograph, every labeled sample bag, every timestamp note in my field log was going to matter potentially in a courtroom someday, and I could not afford a single lapse in discipline, no matter how much my own hands wanted to shake. The demolition crew, I confirmed with a call to the insurer's claims counsel that same hour, was still scheduled to begin site clearance in 37 hours. I want you to walk with me through the exact hours leading up to that call, because the suspense of it is easier to understand once you know exactly how exhausted, how stretched thin, I already was by that point. I had been awake for nearly 30 consecutive hours, save for a single 90-minute nap I'd forced myself to take in my car around hour 10, and my body had reached that particular, jittery state of exhaustion where every sound feels slightly too loud, and every thought takes a beat longer to fully form. I was sitting at a folding table in the insurer's temporary field trailer, surrounded by evidence bags, photographs, and a laptop displaying the timeline I'd spent hours building, when my phone lit up in the dark. Roughly 14 hours into my investigation, exhausted, working through the night at a temporary field office the insurer had set up near the site, my personal cell phone rang. Caleb's number, unblocked, 6 years later, appearing on my screen in the middle of the night. I stared at his name for 4 full rings, my thumb hovering over the decline button, every ounce of professional training screaming at me not to answer. I should not have answered. Every piece of my professional training told me not to. I answered anyway, because some old, stubborn part of me needed, immediately, to know whether he already understood what I'd found. Naomi. Caleb's voice was tight, exhausted, nothing like the easy charm I remembered. I need to talk to you. Please. Not as the investigator on this case. As my sister. Caleb, I can't be on this call, I said, my voice flat, professional, even as my heart pounded. You need counsel to reach out to the insurer's claims department directly. I have to hang up. Naomi, 30 seconds, please. I know what you found in the rear loading section. Someone from the insurer's field office mentioned it to our attorney this afternoon, and I need you to understand something before this goes any further, from me, not from a report. I should have hung up immediately. I have replayed, many times since, exactly why I didn't. I think the honest answer is that some part of me, even after 6 years, still needed to hear whatever he was about to say, the same stubborn hope that had once made me answer a call from a family I'd spent years learning to live without. Dad panicked, Caleb said, his words coming faster now, like he knew he had only a narrow window before I'd end the call. The fire started in the old panel, the one you warned him about all those years ago. Naomi, I know that now. He told me everything 2 nights ago, and I want you to know he has never once stopped feeling sick about it. But once the fire was already burning, once he realized what had actually caused it, he panicked about something else entirely. The company's been drowning in debt for 2 years. We'd let some critical maintenance and safety upgrades slide company-wide, not just that one panel, and he was terrified that if this came out as a straightforward negligence fire, the insurer would deny the claim entirely for known, uncorrected hazard, and the company would be finished, completely, along with 200 jobs. He drove to the site that night, Naomi, after the fire department was already on scene, and in the chaos, before anyone stopped him, he got into the rear loading section and set a second fire, to make the whole thing look like a break-in, like arson by an outsider, something the insurer couldn't deny on a negligence technicality. I sat in complete silence, feeling something colder than fear settle into my chest, a strange, almost physical stillness, like the entire room around me had gone quiet at once. "Caleb," I said finally, "did he know Walter was still inside that building when he did that?" There was a long, terrible pause, long enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears while I waited. "I don't know," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "I've asked him that exact question 3 times in the last 2 days, and every time, he won't give me a straight answer, and Naomi, I am terrified that means the answer is yes." I hung up that call, disclosed the entire conversation to the insurer's claims counsel immediately, verbatim, exactly as protocol required, and spent the following 20 hours in the most intense, focused work of my career, racing to complete a fully documented, court-ready reconstruction of both origin points before the demolition crew's window closed. I built a minute-by-minute timeline correlating the smoke alarm activation logs, the fire department's dispatch and arrival records, and the security system's door access logs. Logs that, I discovered with a jolt around hour 22, showed my father's personal keycard badging into the rear loading section's access door at 2:26 in the morning, 12 minutes after the smoke alarm first triggered, for minutes before the first fire engine arrived on scene. I remember the exact, physical sensation of finding that timestamp, sitting alone at a folding table in the insurer's temporary field trailer, the glow of my laptop screen the only light in the room, my coffee gone cold hours earlier. I stared at that single line of access data for a long time, doing the math over and over, cross-referencing it against the fire department's own arrival log 3 separate times, needing to be absolutely certain before I let myself believe what it was telling me. My own father's keycard, badging into the exact section of the building where the second, deliberately set fire had ignited, in the exact window of time when that fire would have needed to be set. I sat with that knowledge alone, in the dark, for several minutes, before I made myself pick up the phone and call it in, exactly as protocol required, no matter what it meant for the family I had spent 6 years trying to build a life away from. I remember my hand hovering over the call button for a long moment, the trailer silent around me except for the faint hum of a portable heater, before I finally pressed it, understanding, even as I did, that this single phone call was about to change the rest of my father's life, and mine, in ways neither of us could fully undo afterward. At hour 30, I received an update from the insurer's claims counsel that made my stomach drop. Someone associated with the property had contacted the demolition contractor directly, requesting the clearance timeline be moved up by 6 hours, citing safety concerns about the unstable structure. I understood immediately what that meant. Someone in my family, likely my father, was trying to accelerate the destruction of the rear loading section before I could complete a defensible analysis, linking his keycard access to the second point of origin. I called the insurer's claims counsel and requested emergency legal action, a temporary restraining order preventing any site disturbance until my investigation and its independent verification were complete. She told me the earliest a judge could realistically grant that order, given the paperwork involved, was roughly 10 hours out, meaning there was a genuine window, less than half a day, during which the single piece of physical evidence connecting my father to the second fire was legally unprotected and, based on what Caleb had just told me, actively at risk of being erased entirely, permanently, before anyone outside my own family would ever know it existed. I spent those 10 hours in a state of focus I had never experienced before in my career, checking and rechecking every photograph, every sample label, every line of the access log timeline, knowing that if the demolition crew arrived even an hour early, everything I had documented would become the only surviving record of what had actually happened in that building. While that 10-hour window closed, I did something I had not originally planned to do, something that fell slightly outside the strict boundaries of my engagement, but that I could not, in good conscience, leave undone. I drove to the regional trauma center where Walter Higgins remained in the ICU, and I spoke, with his family's permission and a hospital social worker present, to his adult daughter, who had been keeping vigil at his bedside since the night of the fire. I remember sitting across from her in a small, quiet family consultation room down the hall from the ICU, the fluorescent lighting harsh after so many hours spent in the dim, smoky wreckage of the warehouse, and feeling, for the first time in nearly 2 full days, the full human weight of what this investigation actually meant, separate from the timelines and access logs and burn patterns I'd been living inside since the moment I arrived on site. She was exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, a paper coffee cup gone cold in her hands, and she looked at me for a long moment before she spoke, as though trying to decide whether I was there to help her father or simply to build a case around him. She told me something that the company's own explanation to the insurer had conveniently left out. Her father had called her, briefly, from his cell phone at 2:11 in the morning, 3 minutes before the smoke alarm activation log showed the fire had already begun spreading, telling her, in a voice she described as confused and frightened, that the access door to the rear loading section, the one that was supposed to be locked, had been propped open with a piece of scrap wood for 2 full days. Because a delivery crew had needed repeated access for an inventory project, and that he'd gone in to check on a strange burning smell he'd noticed on his rounds. The exact same acrid smell, I realized, standing in that hospital hallway, that I had first identified at that same panel 18 years earlier, still present, still unaddressed, all these years later. I asked her, gently, if she still had that call logged on her phone, and she did, the timestamp confirming exactly what she described, a piece of corroborating evidence I had not expected to find, and that would, in the following weeks, become one of the most critical pieces of the entire timeline. She played me a few seconds of the voicemail her father had left afterward, when she hadn't picked up in time, his voice thick with smoke already, saying only, "Sweetheart, I think there's something wrong here. I'm going to go check it out. I'll call you back," before the recording cut off. Walter had gone to investigate the smell himself, out of the same diligent instinct that had made him a reliable employee for over a decade, walked directly into the path of the fire as it began to spread from the original electrical origin point, and had been trapped there, disoriented by smoke, at the exact moment my father, according to the security logs, badged into that same section 12 minutes later. Not to help him, based on everything Caleb had told me, and everything the timeline was beginning to suggest, but to set a second fire in a section of the building where an injured, possibly already unconscious man was still lying. I stood in that hospital hallway for a long moment after Walter's daughter finished speaking, feeling a wave of anger unlike anything else I experienced during this entire investigation. Not at the electrical panel, not even fully at my father's initial cover-up decision, but at the specific, unbearable possibility that my father may have walked past an injured man, or worse, walked directly over him, in order to protect an insurance claim. I remember having to step outside the hospital for several minutes, into the cold morning air, simply to steady myself before I could get back in my car and return to the site. The restraining order was granted at hour 39, 6 hours before the accelerated demolition window would have begun, securing the rear loading section and its physical evidence permanently. I remember getting the confirmation call while sitting in my car outside the hospital and feeling, for the first time in nearly 2 full days, something loosen in my chest that had been wound impossibly tight since the moment I first found that second point of origin. I sat in that parked car for several minutes afterward, simply breathing, letting the reality of it settle over me before I trusted myself to drive anywhere at all. Combined with the security keycard logs, Walter's daughter's account of his final phone call, and my full forensic documentation of the second point of origin, the investigation's final findings were unambiguous: an accidental electrical fire, originating in a panel my family had been formally warned about 18 years earlier and never repaired, followed by a deliberately set second fire, ignited by my father approximately 12 minutes after the original fire began, in a section of the building where an employee was, at that moment, either unconscious or in the process of losing consciousness from smoke inhalation. I drove back to the site one final time after the order was granted, standing at the edge of the rear loading section in the late afternoon light, watching the demolition crew's equipment sit idle beyond the newly erected barrier tape, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel after everything. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a quiet, exhausted recognition that the truth, however devastating, had finally been given the chance to survive. Walter Higgins survived. His recovery, doctors told his family, was against real odds, complicated by severe smoke inhalation and the second-degree burns he sustained during the additional minutes he remained in that section of the building before firefighters were eventually able to reach him. Minutes that, the fire department's own incident timeline later confirmed, were extended specifically because the rear loading section, now burning from 2 separate points rather than one, had become more dangerous and more difficult to access than it would have been from the electrical fire alone. His daughter told me, months later, that the doctors had described his survival as sitting on a knife's edge for the better part of 5 days, and that she credited the restraining order and the timeline it preserved with giving her father's case the attention and urgency it needed at every stage of his treatment, since hospital staff, once they understood the full circumstances, treated his recovery with an intensity she believes might not have existed if the true cause of his injuries had remained buried under a simple, uncontested accident narrative. My father was charged, ultimately, with insurance fraud, arson, and reckless endangerment. The question of whether he had known Walter was inside that section when he set the second fire became the central, contested issue of the criminal case that followed, one that, as of the writing of this account, remains before the courts. My mother was not charged, though the company itself, Ashford Furniture Manufacturing, was formally dissolved within the year, its remaining assets absorbed almost entirely into a restitution fund for Walter's ongoing medical care and the roughly 200 employees left without jobs. I drove past the site once, months later, on my way to visit Walter's daughter with an update on the case, and found the lot cleared entirely, flat and empty, the demolition finally allowed to proceed once every piece of evidence I needed had been secured, photographed, and formally entered into the case file. I sat in my car at the edge of that empty lot for a long time, looking at the bare ground where a 3-generation family business had once stood, feeling a strange, layered grief that I don't think I've ever fully found the right words for. Grief for what could have been prevented, grief for what was actually lost, and, underneath both of those, a quiet, stubborn relief that the truth, at least, had made it out of that building before the bulldozers ever got there. I want to be honest about what the story is not, because even now I think that honesty matters more than a dramatic ending. This was not a story where I discovered the truth and felt any triumph watching my family's world collapse. What I felt, more than anything, was a complicated, exhausted grief for the 16-year-old girl who did everything right and still wasn't believed, grief for Walter Higgins and everything those extra minutes cost him, grief for a family that had spent generations building something real and then, in a single panic night, nearly destroyed it completely rather than simply telling the truth. I've thought often about the 90 seconds after I found that second point of origin, before my training fully steadied me, when fear and disbelief had every opportunity to slow me down. I think that moment matters as much as anything else in this story. Real courage isn't the absence of that fear. It's the discipline to keep doing the careful, exact work anyway, especially when the clock is running out and the evidence in front of you belongs to your own family. I've thought, too, about the version of the story where I recuse myself the moment I recognize the address on that engagement letter, the safe, unquestionably correct professional choice available to me in that very first hour. I don't regret that I didn't take it. But I also don't think the version of this story, where I stayed on the case, is simply a triumphant one. It's a story about a woman who spent 18 years being quietly told her warnings belonged behind the scenes, discovering, in the worst 48 hours of her life, that behind the scenes was exactly where the danger had been hiding the entire time, waiting patiently for someone with a specific, unglamorous discipline to go looking for it before it was too late for everyone involved. I think, too, about what it means that the very warning I gave at 16 years old turned out, 18 years later, to be the exact, precise cause of everything that followed, not a tangential detail, not a coincidence, but the literal origin point of the fire itself, sitting in the walls of that building the entire time, waiting. I don't know what to do with a fact like that, except to say it out loud, clearly, the way I once tried to at 16 and wasn't believed, and to hope that somewhere, someone listening to this story is standing in a room right now, noticing something nobody else wants to take seriously, and to tell them, trust it. Say it again if you have to. Write it down if no one will listen. You may be the only person in the room who is actually right. I didn't need a 48-hour countdown to know my own worth. I'd known it since I was 16, standing beside a warm, acrid-smelling panel, certain of what I was seeing even when the room around me decided it wasn't worth believing. But there is a difference between knowing your worth privately, for yourself, and discovering, nearly 2 decades later, that the exact warning your family once dismissed as behind-the-scenes noise was the truth all along, waiting patiently in the walls for someone to finally take it seriously. That's the whole story. Thank you for staying with me through every hour of it. If any part of this reminded you of a warning you gave that nobody listened to, a quieter kind of expertise your own family never quite knew how to value, I hope you know what it took me 18 years to learn. Sometimes the people who overlook you are standing closer to disaster than they will ever admit, and the moment it finally catches up to them, your careful, patient, unglamorous instincts are the only thing standing between the truth and the wreckage. I want to leave you with one more thought before I go, because I think it matters more than the drama of the countdown itself. In the months since all of this happened, I've thought often about the exact moment the tone of this entire story shifted. Not the moment I found the electrical panel, and not even the moment I found the second point of origin, but the quiet, unremarkable afternoon 18 years earlier, when a 16-year-old girl stood in a hallway and said clearly, "Something is wrong here," and was told, gently, that it wasn't. I think that's the part of this story I most want anyone listening to actually carry with them. Not the 48 hours. Not the countdown. The moment, so much earlier, so much quieter, where the truth was first spoken out loud and simply wasn't believed. If you are the person in that hallway right now, in whatever version of this story your own life is currently writing, I hope you keep saying it anyway, exactly as clearly as you can, for as long as it takes someone to finally listen. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments, would you have kept working the case after that phone call, or walked away? I read every single one, and after a story like this, I mean that more than ever. I'll see you in the next one.